Yeah, liberal hegemony's track record. Just want to talk a little bit about this. These are the failures of American foreign policy. Talk about the Bush Doctrine and the greater Middle East. Afghanistan. You think we're going to turn Afghanistan into a liberal democracy? Just a question when we turn it back over to the Taliban. Longest war in American history. Iraq, total disaster, led to the creation of ISIS. Hundreds of thousands of people died. Iran now has significant influence in Iraq. Syria, we played a key role in unsettling the regime in Syria. That's worked out really well. Libya, we played a key role in toppling Colonel Gaddafi from power. That's really worked out very well. We're deeply involved in the war in Yemen now, which is a human rights catastrophe. The Americans ought to be embarrassed for their disgraceful behavior, supporting this war, supporting the Saudis. You look at our track record in the greater Middle East, failure after failure. And Donald Trump, to his credit, pointed this out in the campaign. And the American people fully understand this. The elites in this country don't, because they're deeply invested in these wars. But dismal track record. The Ukraine crisis and U.S.-Russia relations, of course, inside the elite, we blame the Russians. The Americans never blame themselves for anything. But actually what happened here is that the United States decided when the Cold War ended that we would take NATO and we would take the EU and we would march them eastward right up to the border of Russia. And what we would do is we would help solidify the democracies that had emerged in Eastern Europe after the Cold War. We would get the countries in Eastern Europe embedded in international institutions like NATO and the EU. We would get them hooked on capitalism, and we would make sure they were liberal democracies. By the way, those countries that weren't liberal democracies, we would foment revolutions. Remember the Orange Revolution in Ukraine? The Rose Revolution in Georgia, right? It's all part of a piece. It's all part of this story. Right? Realists like me, George Kennan, we all said, are you crazy? You think you could take a military alliance that was a mortal enemy of the Soviet Union during the Cold War and march it right up to the Russians' border, and they're just going to sit there and take it? And of course, the Russians screamed bloody murder about NATO expansion from 1995 forward. We didn't listen, right? But it eventually blew up in our face. Georgia, 2008, Ukraine, 2014. We are principally responsible for creating the crisis that led to Russia recapturing Crimea, or capturing Crimea, depending on your view, and for the war in Ukraine today. The Russians have basically said, you're not going to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on our border. Not going to happen. We'll wreck it before we let that happen. And they said the same thing about Georgia. From an American point of view, this makes eminently good sense. You've all heard of the Monroe Doctrine, right? You know what the Monroe Doctrine says? No distant great power from Europe or East Asia is allowed to come into the Western Hemisphere with military force and form an alliance with any country in this region. That's the Monroe Doctrine. I'm old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. We went ballistic when we found out the Soviets had put missiles in Cuba. And then later they were talking about building a naval base at Cienfuegos. Who do these people think they are? Don't they understand that this is the Western Hemisphere? They are not allowed to move military forces into this region. We still have sanctions on Cuba. God knows how many years since 1959 this has been going on. Because the Cubans had the audacity to form a military alliance with a distant great power. Well, as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we can have a Monroe Doctrine, are you shocked that they had a Monroe Doctrine, or they have a Monroe Doctrine? You're shocked that the Russians don't like the idea of us marching NATO right up to their border? You shouldn't be. You shouldn't be. Great powers, I can tell you from studying a lot of military history, are remarkably sensitive about their borders. And the idea that an enemy is going to creep right up to their borders and they're just going to stand there and say, oh, that's okay. We live in a world of peace, love, and dope. That's not the way international politics works. That's realism 101, slamming liberal hegemony. It's also all about nationalism. right? Because the United States is interested in interfering in the politics of both Russia and China. And this brings us to engagement with China. Our goal from the beginning has been to turn China into a liberal democracy. That involves interfering with their politics. Do you think they were happy about that? No, they weren't. Let's go back to the goose and the gander. You've been watching all of these Americans screaming bloody murder about the fact the Russians are interfering in our election. Well, don't you think the Chinese and the Russians are going to scream bloody murder when we try and interfere in their politics? They are. Surprise of surprises. But of course, liberals, and here again I'm talking about Republicans and Democrats, view us as a benign hegemon. We're a benign hegemon. We only have good intentions, and we just want to make the world look like us. And of course, once that happens, we all live happily ever after. Didn't work out that way. Just look at that giant disaster zone called the Middle East. Look at the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who've died. We have a lot of blood on our hands. U.S.-Russian relations, we bear the principal responsibility for the deterioration of those relations. And with regard to engagement, it's been a failure. Principal architects like Kurt Campbell now admit that's true. We failed. The policy has been an abject failure.